Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project Podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with E.C. Sinkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Hello, E.C.
You know, it's been, I think, a month since we talked about protein, so...
I think it's been 14 minutes.
We've got to get back to protein. We can't stray too far.
We are, in fact, going to talk about everybody's favorite macronutrient today. We're going to talk specifically about satiety, what that is, the factors that influence it, and how protein plays a part. Other than our love of protein, what are we talking about? Why are we talking about this in particular?
Yeah, we love talking about protein. Protein intake is, of course, a key part of my recommendations. It's really the second step after the 800-gram challenge, right? So people add this healthy amount, 800 grams of the fruits and veggies to their diet. And then I recommend that they add a certain amount of protein to their diet. And for any new listeners, that protein intake I recommend is the 0.7 grams per pound of their current weight. Now, in cases where the person wants to lose 25 pounds or more, they can use their target weight. But this 0.7 grams per pound I use for almost everyone, especially as a starting point, or especially if people want to lose weight or lose fat, aka improve body composition that we talked about in that podcast. Now, I do think some more sedentary individuals can get away with less, but especially for people wanting to lose weight and to be in this caloric deficit, one of the reasons that I like the 0.7, even if they're a little bit more sedentary, is because of satiety, which is what we're talking about today, and the feeling of fullness. And so that's really what we want to take a little bit more time on understanding that, and really if there's kind of an optimal amount needed for satiety.
Okay, so what controls satiety? Like, what are the actual mechanisms there?
Yeah. Satiety, feeling of fullness. Really, the feeling of fullness is going to help inhibit us from keep eating. It helps us stop the eating at our meal, but also satiety is really then related to how much we eat at the next meal, even when we're going to eat in the next meal. Now, your question of what controls it would be really nice in biology if there was ever just like one, I could just be like, it was this reason. It'd be really nice. Whenever I start like look at these topics, I'm like, okay, and then there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this. It'd be really nice to just be like, okay, it's just how many calories you consumed, or it's just the serving. It's not. Again, we've got to go back to principle 5 that I talk about all the time. It's never one thing. And turns out that our feeling of fullness is influenced by a variety of factors. And so people may be surprised at things like sensory characteristics affect our satiety. Beverages tend to be less satiating than a meal, even if the same number of calories are between the two. And then even things like smell and shape and color. If you've eaten foods of the same smell or shape or color recently, it's going to make that food more satisfying. In other words, you can eat less of similar things, but then once you get something new, you're more likely to eat more, which probably sounds familiar. We tend to like new things, right? We also find that palatability affects satiety. No surprise there. Our processed foods, because of their texture, the way that they even just crunch in our mouth, the sounds they make, they all can kind of antagonize satiety, as I'm sure we know. So we tend to eat more of foods that are very hyper palatable. They're not very satisfying. We also have just cognitive factors that come into play. Literally your beliefs about a food. Like if you think this is a really filling food or a really calorically dense food, that can influence how satisfied you are. If you believe that you're going to be hungry after eating this thing, you likely will be. Even
That's
cognitive.
Mean.
It's so crazy how many different things can come into play. But your beliefs, your beliefs are a strong one. Even beliefs about what you think you should be eating. If you're in a social situation, you might all of a sudden be more full than you would be at home, right? Also, if you pay attention to what you're eating, you might be watching TV or just on the computer, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, the bag of chips is gone, or oh wow, the pint of ice cream just happened, right? When we're distracted eating, it tends to be less satisfying. So all of those things are sort of surrounding the meal experience, I would say. But then the actual meal quantity and its composition also has its own effects, like the size of the meal, the serving size, the physical stretching of your stomach walls will send nerve signals to the brain via the vagus nerve, and it will send the signals to stop eating. And so this is why, of course, the 800-gram challenge helps with satiety, because it's just a very big volume. And then, of course, there are satiety peptides that get released in the GI tract, like cholecystokinin or CCK, that helps with the signaling of stomach distension. So again, we feel more full. GLP-1, that's the hormones that the weight loss drugs emulate, and that's released to help slow the stomach from emptying. And so more things in the stomach, again, help with this feeling of fullness. We've got peptide YY, another one to help slow gastric emptying. So these are all released in response to kind of what you ate and how much of it. And then we also have other hormones that help and cue satiety. For example, there's the release of insulin that we've talked about from the pancreas. And in fact, when we have a big release of insulin, that tends to be more satisfying. We talked about that in the How to Hack Hunger podcast. We have leptin. Leptin's a hormone released by the fat cells. If we have a lot of fat storage, we have more leptin released, and that helps let us know that, okay, we've eaten a lot. And so there's all of these different factors, and really I've just skimmed the surface here, from sensory quality of foods to what the composition of is and how much we ate, to some of these longer term hormonal signalings that all come into play related to, okay, I'm going to stop eating, and then how long will I go before I start eating again?
You mentioned that the 800 gram challenge, part of why it works is that it increases satiety. What about protein? What about that side of things? Why does protein do something similar that fruits and vegetables do in terms of satiety?
Yeah, so of course protein can be part of a large meal, right? Like if you have a steak or something like that, that can be more filling, or chicken, especially if it's in combination with other foods, that can help with that physical volume. But then we do have some specific effects of protein. So I mentioned all of those satiety peptides secreted in the GI tract. So protein has an effect on those hormones. I mentioned cholecystokinin, the CCK. I mentioned peptide YY. I mentioned GLP-1. Turns out when you eat protein specifically, it has an effect on the release of those. Now, to be clear, other macros can have effect on those peptides. It's not only protein. There's a study in the show notes by Kohanmu, and it's a meta-analysis looking at protein consumption on appetite and these appetite hormones, both in the short and the long term. Now, short term, what they considered for that was, okay, what does appetite look like in the few hours after a meal? Where long term was, what does appetite look like in the few days or months after these meals with protein, right? And so they pulled together their research from 49 different studies for the short-term effect and only 19 for the long-term effect. Of course, it's harder to do research on long-term, so less studies. And basically, they found that protein did decrease hunger and the desire to eat, as well as increased fullness and satiety in the short term. And they did find these short-term changes in the hormones like CCK and GLP-1 that I mentioned. In the long term, however, they did not find that these effects were consistently observed. Now, of course, like all studies, more research needs to be done, and they cite some limitations of why that is the case. But nevertheless, that is what they found. But what's interesting, I actually think most of us are not primarily interested in just appetite. The reason that we're interested in appetite is because we want weight loss. So it's worth it also looking around and seeing, okay, what about research on higher protein diets and weight loss is out there, right? And there's a couple studies in the show notes. There's one by Moon and there's one by Hansen, and they both conclude that higher protein diets have more weight loss compared to same caloric level diets with lower protein levels. Now, these higher protein diets don't end up driving a ton of weight loss, but the Hansen study reports there's about 1.6 kilograms greater weight loss, about 3.5 pounds greater when the diets have this higher protein consumption. But it does beg the question, of course, of, when I say a higher protein diet, what exactly is that level that we're talking about? Now, the Moon study found that this higher protein intake was up to 1.6 grams per kilogram of protein, which ultimately translates to my 0.7 grams per pound. So again, another example where a higher protein diet in the literature is not synonymous with 1 gram per pound, and more evidence that it often refers to this 0.7 grams per pound that I recommend, if not even a little bit less. So this is interesting. Like, why might protein have this weight loss effect? It could be because of some of the effect on appetite, although, like I said, that other earlier study did not actually find that the appetite changed in the long term. But there's two other pluses around protein. The first is it could increase your lean mass. So if we add some lean mass, and of course, especially if we added lean mass in combination with resistance training. But if we add some lean mass, we might end up getting a little bit more boost in the calories that we burn any single day, because more muscle mass in the body burns more calories. So maybe a person who adds a little bit of protein to their diet, if they were moderately active, maybe that helps them add a pound or two of lean mass. And so that can start to accumulate a little bit more calories burned per day. The second thing about protein is it has this higher thermic effect of food. So we burn calories to digest and absorb our food. And so protein costs more calories to digest and absorb than carbs or fat. Now, this isn't a reason to make your diet 100% protein. There are other nutrients we need to enjoy our diet. But this is how, like, when you up your protein a little bit, you might also get a little boost in burning more calories simply because of the digestion costs from protein. So maybe this combination of slightly more lean mass, slightly more calories burned in digestion adds up to a little bit more of a caloric deficit, which explains that maybe this is why we actually see weight loss on a higher protein diet, even if it's not specifically related to changing appetite hormones.
Okay, so if it's not a 100% protein diet, what is the, when we talked about 0.7 grams per pound as your baseline or as your recommendation, is there an upper end of that recommendation? Given that it seems like a diet higher in protein can help all of these things?
Yeah, there was this is actually kind of how this podcast started, because I ran into this study by Roberts in the show notes, and they wanted to look at basically protein satiety, because it's kind of accepted out there that, like protein helps with satiety. Now, as I just mentioned, maybe it's not really satiety and appetite, maybe it's the other effects. But anyway, they wanted to tackle this angle, and they wanted to see, like, okay, maybe is more protein better from a satiety point of view? And so this is the Roberts study in the show notes. It's a smaller study. It's 16 resistance-trained athletes, and they were put in caloric deficits of about 20%. And then they were given what they considered in the study a moderate amount of protein, which happens to be at 0.8 grams per pound. So slightly more than my recommendation, but pretty much right there. And they compared that to then what they considered a high protein intake, or double that, at 1.6 grams per pound. So really high level of protein. And then they looked at markers like peptide YY and the stuff that we talked about, as well as they just looked at hunger and fullness and satisfaction by asking the participants, not just looking at the biochemical markers. And basically what they found was that the high protein intake, the 1.6 grams per pound, did not confer any additional benefits on satiety and fullness relative to the 0.8 grams per pound. Now, they didn't actually test 0.7, so we can't say that, 0.7 is more optimal than 0.8. But honestly, we're splitting hairs there. We're right in the ballpark of like, hey, this level of protein around the 0.7, around the 0.8 grams per pound is going to be enough for satiety. And so I feel like this is something that we've kind of touched on before with protein. There is a point when we've hit just enough, and that more isn't always better. Right? There is a point of protein which, okay, this was what's going to help us increase our lean mass. And then once we go above and beyond that, it's just going to be used for energy, just like carbs and fat will, right? Same thing here. There is a point at which protein perhaps can help with satiety, which they found in this study to be 0.8 grams per pound. And then above and beyond that, like, it's not going to be the thing that fixes all of your appetite woes. So I really think that this is another great example that the 0.7 grams per pound, we're right there, is going to be sort of the upper limit from a satiety point of view, especially if you're trying to lose weight or lean out. Now, there are going to be some people that are higher for other reasons. Maybe they're super muscular, maybe they're super active, maybe they have super high amount of calories. But definitely for people who are looking for more weight maintenance, leaning out, body composition, this is plenty high enough from the muscle mass that we've talked about before, but now also from the satiety perspective.
We know, because you repeat it as often as possible, that it's never one thing. So is there anything else, any other factors maybe that we haven't touched on yet related to satiety that are worth talking about as we consider what the makeup of our diets actually are?
Yeah. Diet satisfaction. Not actually the same thing as diet satiety. Satiety is this feeling of fullness. Physical feeling of being full, like I'm stuffed type of phenomenon, where diet satisfaction is the mental feeling of like, I like this diet, I'm not deprived. And so they're not always the same thing. Like, you can feel really full after eating a pound of cantaloupe, but you might still want chocolate, right? So, I think diet satisfaction is one of these levers that we really can't overlook because it's not necessarily an essential nutrient or whatever. Like if we want to see results, we have to stick to the diet. And a big factor of whether or not you're going to be able to stick to the diet is if you like it, aka you're satisfied. And so this is why making the diet as flexible as possible is really important to me. Like when a person gets to choose the foods they like, they're more likely to stick to the diet. Now, of course, there's always going to be some balance here that if they're not at their goal yet, they're going to have to change something about what they're currently doing. But nevertheless, I really endeavor to maximize choice for the individual at every step along the way. And so even for something like the fruits and vegetable challenge, it's a new name. Even something like the 800-gram challenge where we're consuming our fruits and vegetables.
I think we just renamed it the fruits and vegetables challenge.
Somebody actually just was like, oh, your 6 cups challenge. I was like, hey, that's pretty close.
That is actually pretty good.
And but even something with the 800-gram challenge, like, yeah, it's fruits and vegetables. Guess what? I included potatoes and I included beans because I knew from a nutrition point of view, it got after the same thing that the fruits and vegetables did. And then it allowed even a greater choice for people. And even then within that, like, I don't micromanage your fruits and veggies. I don't tell you that you have to have this many fruits or this many veggies, or you should always have something green. A lot of the reason why is because it gives the person a lot of choice. Even then when we get to protein, I don't mandate it has to be only whole foods. It doesn't only have to be animal foods. I want to keep the level as low as possible. That's within the strike zone of my clients' goals. And all of that is to, again, help the person be able to stick to the diet and have diet satisfaction. And part of the reason with this keeping the protein low, or I don't want to say low, it's high, but as low as possible relative to the goals that they want, is to free up calories to spend elsewhere. Most clients that I work with would prefer having a glass of wine than an extra protein shake. Now, I can already see some comments coming through on this about people can't believe that I would say such a thing. I'm not saying replace all of your protein with wine. Make sure you heard that correctly. What I'm saying is we're going to eat enough protein for our needs, but then we're not going to overshoot that such that we have freedom in our diet to enjoy the foods that we like, because this is now going to be the reason that we actually stick to the diet. And so I find that the more that I think about it, the more that I think this overshooting and obsession with high protein is actually just another form of a restrictive diet. Because it's cutting out the flexibility to enjoy the foods that you love, right? Which is an interesting way to look at it. And so we really want to make sure that we allow for people's preferences, allow for the foods that they love, because that will then give this diet satisfaction adherence. So satiety is important for sure. There are other factors to look at, and one of them is diet satisfaction. And we want to make sure that we allow for that.
Love it. Crazy that you would think that being satisfied was... is something you need to make the case for.
Hey, long term, we got to stick to this thing, so we got to enjoy it.
Agreed. Okay. Thank you, EC. Thank you as always. Thank you everyone out there for listening. Thank you for your ratings and your reviews. Make sure you are subscribed wherever you're listening or watching this so you don't miss another episode. EC and I will be back next week for a brand new episode of The Consistency. Just forgot the word for a second. For the Consistency Project Podcast.
I was like, what's the name today?